April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. Temperature at altitude -48 degrees Celsius. Visibility low, cloud cover dense. Through the thin veil of frost forming on the canopy, Lieutenant Carl Hermansen adjusted his oxygen mask and looked at the distant horizon. He was a seasoned pilot, an ace with 10 confirmed kills to his name. Below him, the occupied lands of France stretched like a sleeping beast. Above, only silence and clouds. The Luftwaffe formation flew in disciplined patterns, tight, rehearsed, like dancers repeating a deadly choreography. Orders crackled through the radio in short-clipped German, cold, efficient, confident. Hermansen grinned behind the mask. The Americans were coming, and with them, more of those ridiculous P-47s. He had seen one up close once. Huge, clumsy, more tractor than fighter. The Luftwaffe pilots had started calling them flying milk bottles, heavy, slow, and unworthy of fear. One of their squadron mates even joked that you could hit one with a key if you stood on a ladder. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air that didn't come from the enemy. It came from the clouds themselves. The formation passed 27,000 feet. Still no contact, just radio chatter and the whine of engines. Then it happened. It began not with a sound, but with the absence of one. The radio that moments ago had been alive with updates and orders fell silent. Not broken static, not interference. Silence, complete and unnatural. Blinked and checked his gauges, thinking the fault was local. But his instruments were fine. He looked around. Every pilot in formation was still flying, but no one was speaking. The silence felt like a vacuum had opened inside the cockpit. Seconds later, a shadow appeared through the clouds, not descending, rising. It wasn't alone. 1, 2, 3, then dozens. The clouds split like torn fabric, and the sky filled with the gleam of silver monsters. They didn't twist or roll. They like dancers in a duel. They came like freight trains in the sky, solid, relentless, without warning, without panic, only purpose. Carl's breath caught as he watched the first one fly past. Massive, blunt, squat wings bristling with machine guns. The nose dipped slightly. A streak of muzzle flashes lit the gray sky. Streams of heavy .50 caliber rounds tore the air. The burst wasn't random. It was measured, controlled. The kind of discipline that spoke not of desperation, but doctrine, instinctively. Hermansen. His instincts saved his life. 2 of his squadron mates weren't so lucky. Flames blossomed in his peripheral vision. He pulled back on the stick, turning hard, trying to regroup, trying to find the voice of his commander on the radio. Nothing. The silence was still there. Not a single word. Only the scream of his own engine and the distant rumble of thunderbolts thundering down like judgment. It was in that moment he realized the silence wasn't technical. It was psychological. These weren't the clumsy Americans of 1942. These weren't the confused formations that scattered at the sight of a Bf-109. This was something else. Something trained, something focused, and worst of all, something that wasn't afraid anymore. He turned again and caught sight of one of them flying level with a German fighter, just long enough to tear it apart with a single burst before pulling away in a vertical climb no FW-190 could follow. It wasn't combat. It was dismantling. One aircraft at a time, methodical, mechanical, inevitable. No one laughed now. In the days after, the Luftwaffe command would try to rationalize the loss. Blame poor coordination, inferior altitude advantage, weather conditions. But the men who survived that mission knew the truth. The Americans had arrived with something new. Not just a new plane, a new presence, a new doctrine, a new tempo. One that didn't rely on flair or instinct. One that came from factories, industrial rhythm too heavy to stop. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe wasn't hunting. It was being hunted. It wasn't just about who had the better aircraft. It was about who could keep flying longer, who could afford mistakes, who had the fuel, the metal, the manpower to keep the sky filled. And in that cold, soundless moment above France, as silver wings sliced through the mist, the truth became painfully clear. The Luftwaffe could not win a war of silence, because silence meant something different now. It meant the Americans were no longer broadcasting. They were executing. And when the radios go quiet, it's already too late. This is more than history. This is the anatomy of a turning point. If this story moved you, leave your thoughts in the comments and consider joining us for more forgotten tales like this one. Subscribe to stay connected with stories the sky still remembers. It was never meant to be a fighter. In the beginning, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a brute of a machine that didn't fit into the sleek vision of aerial combat. When engineers at Republic Aviation unveiled the prototype in 1941, many questioned whether the beast could even lift off the ground. Weighing nearly 8 tons when fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war. Taller than most of the pilots who flew it, and longer than the average Luftwaffe bomber, the aircraft seemed more like a flying bunker than a dogfighter. Yet, what the world saw as a flaw was, in truth, its defining strength. At the heart of the Thunderbolt roared the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. It didn't purr, it didn't hum, it growled, a deep, throaty, mechanical thunder that rattled hangars before it ever left the runway. But that was only half the secret. Beneath the belly of the P-47, hidden inside its rotund fuselage, sat a piece of engineering brilliance that would change everything. The turbo supercharger, a complex web of pipes, compressors, and intercoolers that allowed the Thunderbolt to breathe at altitudes where most engines suffocated. While other fighters gasped for power above 20,000 feet, the P-47 climbed higher, faster, stronger. It didn't just survive the thin air, it thrived in it, and that mattered, because at those high altitudes, above flak and weather, is where the B-17s flew, and the Thunderbolt was born to escort them. Its wings were broad, thick, and carried more than just lift. They carried 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, 4 on each side, over 3,400 rounds in total, more firepower than any other Allied single-engine fighter. When all 8 guns fired at once, it sounded like rolling thunder, a deafening roar that shredded metal and morale alike. In test ranges, the recoil alone would shake the entire frame. But in combat, it became a hammer blow from the sky. To German pilots, it was shocking. The first time a P-47 returned fire, many Luftwaffe aces underestimated it. They would get behind the Thunderbolt, open up with cannon fire, and expect it to fall apart. But it didn't. Its cockpit was armored. Its engine was built like a tank. Its fuel system self-sealed. Even with bullets ripping through its fuselage, it kept flying, over and over again. In a war where one mistake could mean death, the P-47 gave its pilots something rare: margin. There are countless stories of Thunderbolts returning to base with parts of wings missing, tails shredded, control surfaces gone. One pilot limped back with a third of his rudder blown clean off. Another had 200 bullet holes in his fuselage and a fire in his right wing. He landed, got out, and flew again the next day. It was less an airplane and more a force of nature. But not everyone saw it that way at first. To the Luftwaffe, it looked too slow to dogfight, too heavy to climb, too awkward to chase. They watched its long takeoff runs and sluggish turn radius and laughed. That was their mistake. They were still thinking in terms of the last war. The Thunderbolt belonged to the next one, because speed, as it turned out, was relative. In a dive, the P-47 could hit over 700 kilometers per hour, and at that speed, the laws of physics shifted in its favor. German fighters like the Bf-109 or FW-190 would begin to shake and lose control under such pressure. The Thunderbolt? It stayed steady. That weight the Luftwaffe mocked became the reason it could survive nose-down power, dives, and pull back up without ripping its wings off. It changed the rules of engagement. Rather than turn and twist, the American pilots learned to climb high, dive hard, fire, and disappear. They didn't need to outturn the enemy. They just needed to hit first. It was a new kind of warfare, not about finesse, about overwhelming presence. Still, for the average airman looking up at its massive frame for the first time, it was intimidating. In training fields across the United States, young pilots stared at the Thunderbolt like a mountain they were expected to climb. Many had never flown anything close to that size. It dwarfed the training aircraft. It roared louder. It needed longer runways, more fuel, more maintenance. And yet, it became their shield, their sword, their salvation. There is a photo still preserved today, a black and white shot of a P-47 returning from a mission over occupied France. The left wing is almost entirely shot through, flaps dangling, engine smoking. But in the cockpit, the pilot raises 2 fingers in a V for victory. He made it back. The Thunderbolt carried him home. That was the contract between pilot and machine. The pilot would fight with courage, and the Thunderbolt would not give up on him. Behind every rivet was not just steel. It was a promise. And as the war dragged on and losses mounted, those promises mattered more than ever. Because in the vast sky over Europe, it was no longer enough to fly fast or shoot straight. You had to endure, to return, to fight again tomorrow. And the Thunderbolt endured. For many Luftwaffe pilots, the realization came too late. The same aircraft they once mocked now dominated the high altitudes. Its shadow stretched across France, Belgium, and deep into Germany. The roar of its engine meant trouble, and the weight they laughed at now crushed them. If stories like this make you feel something real, take a moment to leave a comment below. Let us know what struck you most, and if you want to keep exploring these forgotten moments that shaped history, make sure to subscribe and come along with us. The past still echoes if you know where to listen. In 1943, the war in the skies over Europe was not just a clash of metal and fuel. It was a contest of belief. On one side, the Luftwaffe, seasoned, precise, forged in the crucible of the Blitzkrieg. On the other, the United States Army Air Forces, ambitious, untested, and for many German pilots, laughably naive. The contrast was almost theatrical. German fighter pilots, many with dozens of confirmed kills, had flown through the fires of Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. They were not just experienced, they were confident, at times even arrogant. They had seen enemies fall from the sky in flames. They had fought, outnumbered, and survived. To them, the Americans were little more than rich amateurs with big engines and soft nerves. And then came the P-47 Thunderbolt. It did not look like a threat. To the trained eye of a Luftwaffe ace, the Thunderbolt was an oversized, overweight, under-agile anomaly. It climbed like a brick, turned like a barn door, and looked like a tractor with wings. When the first groups of P-47s began escorting American bombers in early 1943, German pilots could barely contain their contempt. They nicknamed it the flying milk bottle. Not because it was smooth or white or elegant, but because it was thick, bulky, and awkward. The kind of aircraft that seemed more suited for towing gliders or hauling cargo than facing down a Messerschmitt in combat. In mess halls and briefings, Luftwaffe squadrons joked that the P-47 was the only plane you could outmaneuver by walking, and for a time, it seemed they were right. American pilots, many in their early 20s, fresh from stateside training fields, often lacked the instincts and reflexes honed by years of war. Their formations were sloppy, their tactics rigid, and when they did engage, they tried to dogfight, a mistake that German pilots capitalized on with brutal efficiency. Dozens of Thunderbolts were lost in those early months. Some never even fired a shot in return. But something strange began to happen. Even when damaged, the P-47s kept coming, over and over, in pairs, in squadrons, in entire wings. Some returned to base looking like floating wrecks, trailing smoke, wings torn by cannon fire. Others crash-landed in fields or on Allied runways far from home. But many survived, more than expected, and that survival rate began to plant a seed of doubt. Because while the Luftwaffe was still winning tactically, they were bleeding strategically. Each Thunderbolt lost was replaced, not in weeks, not in months, but in days. Fresh aircraft were arriving from American factories faster than German mechanics could bury the wreckage of their own. Pilots, too, trained en masse, rotated in and out like gears in a machine. The Germans, meanwhile, were burning through veterans. Replacing them was harder, slower, often impossible. And then came the realization that would change the tone of every encounter. The Thunderbolt was not trying to be a better dogfighter. It was something else entirely. Something that ignored the rules the Luftwaffe had spent years mastering. It did not need to outturn. It needed to outlast. It is hard to describe the psychological shift that happens when an enemy you once laughed at starts returning fire with cold precision, when the same machine you ridiculed begins to score kills against your most experienced pilots. When your jokes about milk bottles are replaced by reports of downed comrades and missing squadrons. One German pilot later wrote in his diary that facing the Thunderbolt was like trying to kill a steam engine with a hammer. You could hit it, damage it, even slow it down, but it kept moving, and eventually, it would roll right over you. There is a photo from 1943, taken by a Luftwaffe ground crew after an American raid. A shot-down Thunderbolt sits in a field, torn and scorched. German soldiers stand around it, examining the wreck, and on the fuselage, in chipped paint, is a name scrawled by its American pilot. Not a boast, not a threat, just one word: resilience. That was the soul of the P-47. Not elegance, not speed, not flair, but stubborn, relentless survival. The kind that wore enemies down not with one victory, but with 10,000 return missions. The kind that said, "We may fall, but we will not stop." What once seemed like weakness, now revealed as design. The bulk, armor. The size, fuel capacity. The weight, stability in a dive. The simplicity, easier to mass produce, easier to repair, easier to fly again. And in the silence between dogfights, Luftwaffe pilots began to wonder, how do you defeat an enemy that learns faster than you can teach? How do you win a war against someone who does not play by your rules? If this glimpse into the shifting skies above Europe sparked something in you, we invite you to leave your thoughts in the comments. Every perspective adds depth to the stories we uncover. And if you're drawn to the hidden moments of history that shape the world we live in, hit subscribe and stay with us. There is so much more to remember. In the spring and summer of 1943, the skies over Western Europe became a crucible of fire, smoke, and shattered metal. The United States had committed to a bold strategy: daylight precision bombing, a concept that sounded brilliant in theory, but in practice was a meat grinder for men and machines. Flying fortresses, the B-17s, lumbered across the English Channel in box formations so tight you could almost step from wingtip to wingtip. Their mission was surgical: to cripple the German war machine by striking industrial centers, rail yards, ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants. It was science, logic, and logistics. What it was not, however, was safe, because every mission past the 250-mile range line meant one thing: they would fly beyond the reach of Allied fighter cover. The P-47 Thunderbolt, for all its power and altitude, was still limited in fuel. Early versions lacked drop tanks. That meant the moment they reached their maximum range, the Thunderbolts had to turn back. And once they did, the bombers were alone. Waiting for them were squadrons of Bf-109s and FW-190s, fast, maneuverable, and flown by veterans who knew exactly where and when to strike. They did not engage recklessly. They calculated. They approached from above or from the IE sun. They tore into the American formations with ruthless discipline, diving in with bursts of cannon fire and peeling away before the defensive gunners could react. A single German pass could take out 2 or 3 bombers, sometimes more. It was not uncommon to see entire bomber groups return with missing planes, engines smoking, fuselages ripped apart, and gunners slumped lifeless in their positions. The radio chatter on those return flights was often filled with silence, or worse, a single pilot calling out the names of friends who never answered. One mission in particular became a symbol of that dark period. Regensburg, August 17, 1943. The operation called for a deep strike into southern Germany, targeting Messerschmitt production facilities. Over 300 B-17s launched that morning. The Thunderbolts flew as far as they could, then turned back. The Luftwaffe was waiting. By the time the mission was over, 60 American bombers were missing. Hundreds of airmen were dead, captured, or drifting under parachutes into enemy territory. The factories were hit, yes, but the cost was staggering. And yet, the message from command remained firm. Continue. More missions, more pressure. The strategy would break the enemy, eventually. But in the meantime, it broke the crews. Survivors came back pale, bloodied, often crying quietly while being pulled from their aircraft. Some refused to eat. Others stared blankly at the wall of the mess hall for hours. One pilot, after his 10th mission, walked off the flight line, handed in his gear, and never flew again. They were not cowards. They were exhausted. But even in those moments of despair, there was something else rising. A growing respect for the machines that brought them home, for the armor that held under fire, for the Thunderbolts that had fought beside them as far as fuel allowed, and for the crews on the ground that turned wrecks into wings again. At an airfield near East Anglia, a Thunderbolt returned from escort duty with one wheel missing and holes punched clean through its fuselage. The pilot radioed ahead, said he was coming in hot. The landing was rough, but he survived. When mechanics opened the aircraft, they found a single unexploded 20mm shell lodged behind the armor plating near the cockpit. Had it detonated, the pilot would not have made it. The next day, that same pilot climbed into a different P-47 and took off again. Because for every bomber that fell, another took its place. For every Thunderbolt that burned, a dozen waited on the runway. It was a war of attrition. Brutal, cold, mechanical. But behind that machinery were men who refused to give in. There was a quiet oath, unspoken, but deeply understood. If you made it back, you flew again. And the Thunderbolt, for all its flaws and weight, was the aircraft that gave you the best odds of doing exactly that. It was not glory they sought. It was survival. Mission after mission. Until the numbers tipped. Until the factories in Germany slowed. Until the flak guns fell silent. Until there were no more enemy fighters waiting at the edge of the range line. That day had not yet come, but it was coming. And those who lived through the fire knew that each time they climbed into the cockpit, they were not just fighting a battle, they were buying time. For every new pilot learning to fly, for every new P-47 rolling off the line, for every chance to finally turn the tide. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, comment, leave, and tell us what moment struck you hardest. Your voice matters in keeping memory alive. And if you want to continue down the path of these incredible true histories, subscribe now. There is more to uncover. The sky still holds its secrets. By late 1943, the American air war over Europe was bleeding at the seams. The bombers were going deeper. The losses were mounting. And while the P-47 Thunderbolt was earning respect for its durability, its role was still seen as reactive, flying just far enough to protect the formations, then turning back when fuel dictated retreat. For the German Luftwaffe, this was predictable, a game they had mastered. Wait for the Thunderbolts to vanish, then strike the B-17s like wolves chasing down wounded prey. But something subtle was changing. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group and others began noticing a pattern. Every time they tried to outmaneuver German fighters in traditional turning dogfights, they paid a heavy price. The Bf-109s and FW-190s could turn inside a Thunderbolt without even sweating. Every time an American tried to match them turn for turn, they either lost their edge or their lives. And then someone broke the rhythm. It is unclear exactly who did it first. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps instinct. But one day, instead of turning, a P-47 pilot pushed the nose down. He dove hard, straight through the altitude floor the Germans were comfortable with. The aircraft screamed toward the earth at terrifying speed. The PE controls stiffened. The wings groaned, but the Thunderbolt held. Behind him, the German fighter followed and lost control. At high speeds, the Luftwaffe's finest machines were vulnerable. Compressibility, structural stress, control flutter. The very thing they used to dominate at medium altitudes became their weakness in the dive. But the P-47, heavy and strong, was built to survive those forces. It did not shudder. It did not break apart. It punched through the air like a meteor. Boom, zoom, and that became the name of the new tactic. Instead of turning engagements, American pilots began to fight vertically. Climb high, stalk the enemy, then dive with crushing speed. Fire a concentrated burst of 850 caliber guns and climb back to altitude before the enemy could respond. It was shock warfare in the air, short, violent, devastating. The Thunderbolt was suddenly not a brawler. It was a sniper with wings. In training, instructors began to shift their doctrine. New pilots were told not to engage in turning fights unless absolutely necessary. Use your altitude. Use your speed. Hit and run. This was not cowardice. This was tactics backed by physics and engineering. In one after-action report, a pilot recalled engaging a pair of FW-190s over northern France. Instead of weaving into a turning dogfight, he pulled into a steep climb. The Germans tried to follow, but the Thunderbolt kept rising. He crested the climb, rolled inverted, and dove back down, catching the second fighter in a crossfire and tearing it apart in a single pass. Later, that same pilot would say, "I did not outfly them. I outclimbed them. I outdove them. And then I outlived them." It was not just an improvement in combat effectiveness, it was a psychological shift. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's tactics had to adapt. German pilots began reporting Thunderbolts appearing from nowhere, diving from absurd altitudes, firing, and vanishing back into the clouds. It was disorienting. The very weight and bulk that once made the P-47 a joke were now its greatest weapons. Mass became momentum, and momentum became survival. The Luftwaffe began losing its grip on the vertical dimension. They had ruled the air by controlling engagements on their terms, but now they were reacting, trying to anticipate where the Thunderbolts would strike, often failing. One of the most telling signs of the shift came not from the skies, but from the ground. Intelligence units began intercepting German communications, referring to the Thunderbolt not just by type, but by behavior. "They do not fight fair," one pilot radioed. "They fall out of the sky like anvils, and we are the target." As the Americans mastered the boom and zoom, their kill ratios improved, and more importantly, their confidence grew. New formations were organized. Wingmen coordinated their climbs and dives like orchestrated movements. Even the sound of the P-47 diving became a fear trigger, a deep howl of compressed air that meant pain was seconds away. For the bomber crews, this change was more than tactical. It was emotional. They began to feel the difference in the skies. The Thunderbolts were no longer just a short escort window. They were a presence, a wall, a message to the Germans that the days of free hunting were coming to an end. There is a moment captured in the war diaries of a B-17 radio operator. He wrote about a mission over Frankfurt, where flak had scattered their formation. German fighters closed in fast. Then, through a break in the cloud cover, he saw 3 Thunderbolts emerge at full speed from altitude. One opened fire from so far away, it looked like sparks in the distance, but within seconds, the fighters broke off. "The sky," he wrote, "felt like it belonged to us again." This was no accident. It was a deliberate evolution, a change not just in tactics, but in mindset. The Americans were learning, adapting, building experience from blood and wreckage, and the P-47, once underestimated by both sides, was becoming the hammer of that change. It would take time for the full impact to be understood, but the thunder was getting louder, the shock waves stronger, and with each new dive from the heavens, the war began to tilt. If this kind of story sparks something deep in you, a sense of awe, a connection to sacrifice, or just a need to understand more, write it in the comments. Share your thoughts, your family's story, or what you've learned. And if you want to keep unlocking the hidden layers of World War II, hit subscribe. This journey is far from over. The morning sky over occupied France was quiet, too quiet. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin, the engines groaned against the cold, and every heartbeat inside a cockpit echoed like a drum in the chest. Robert S. Johnson adjusted his flight path slightly, scanning the horizon through his canopy, smudged with oil and ice. It was just another mission. Another day in a sky that had taken too many of his friends. His P-47 Thunderbolt, the Paddle, one he called Half Pint, was not pristine. It had flown hard, hit harder, and kept going. It carried the scars of past fights, with patches of metal covering bullet holes like badges. Johnson himself had already survived more than 24 missions, a rising ace with kills to his name, and the kind of stare that no longer blinked at flak bursts. But nothing in his young life had prepared him for what was coming. It started with a flash, a brief moment of stillness torn by tracers. Then came the thunder. Not his, but the enemy's. A Bf-109 had latched onto him from above and behind, a textbook move. Cannon shells ripped into his Thunderbolt with precision. The engine shuddered. Oil sprayed across the glass. Alarms screamed in the cockpit. Johnson tried to pull away, But the aircraft was losing power fast. Controls were sluggish. He was wounded, bleeding. The oxygen mask now carried the metallic taste of blood. Smoke filled the cockpit. The radio crackled, then died. Altitude dropped rapidly. He was alone, spiraling through a sky that had become a coffin. Logic said, bail out, but Johnson could not. The canopy had jammed, trapped, and so he did the only thing left. He gripped the stick with blood-slicked gloves and flew. Below, countryside approached with terrifying speed. But somehow, the P-47 leveled, damaged, dragging smoke and fire. It refused to die, just like the man inside it. The Bf-109 came back. Its pilot was no amateur. He had seen multiple direct hits. It should have been a kill, but there it was, still flying, wounded but defiant. The German lined up behind Johnson for the final blow. He fired again. More cannon shells tore into the fuselage. Pieces flew off. Still, the Thunderbolt flew, slower now, lower, but alive. A third pass, another burst, more holes. The P-47 began to wobble. One wing dipped sharply, threatening to send it into a death spin. But somehow, Johnson corrected. Smoke poured out. The German pilot closed in once more, and then he stopped. Perhaps it was confusion, or admiration, or disbelief. The Bf-109 pulled alongside Johnson's plane. The German pilot looked across, and for the first time, saw the face of the man he had been trying to kill. A face covered in blood, eyes burning with will. The two men held that stare for a second that stretched forever. Then the German saluted and vanished into the clouds. Johnson flew the ruined Thunderbolt back across enemy lines. Somehow, impossibly, he crossed into friendly airspace and made it back to England. The ground crew stared in shock as the aircraft landed, smoke trailing behind it like a veil of war. The plane was riddled with holes, over 200 visible hits. The control surfaces were shredded. A piece of the canopy had been blown away. The tail section was barely attached, but it was back, and so was he. When they pulled Johnson from the cockpit, his uniform was soaked in blood and oil. His hands trembled, not from fear, adrenaline of survival. He had stared death in the face, and death had blinked. What happened in the sky that day became legend, not because of the damage, not because of the kill count, but because of what it revealed. The P-47 was not just a fighter, it was a survivor. And Johnson was not just a pilot. He was the living embodiment of the aircraft's design philosophy. Brutal resilience, relentless endurance, unshakable will. In later interviews, he would downplay the incident. He would say, German had probably run out of ammo. That maybe luck had played a part. But those who saw the aircraft knew better. There was no luck in that landing. There was only grit. The story spread quickly across the squadrons. Pilots whispered it at the edge of airfields. Crews told it while loading bombs. It gave them something rare in those days, a sense that even when the sky turned black, there was still a chance. Johnson's flight became more than a report. It became a symbol, a reminder that the EBA Thunderbolt was not just armor and guns, it was defiance made of steel, and in the right hands, it could carry a man through hell and bring him back. There were other missions, other kills. Johnson would go on to become one of the top American aces in Europe. But that moment, the day he should have died but didn't, stayed carved in history. Not because of the damage taken, but because of the decision to keep flying. To anyone who has ever felt crushed, outnumbered, or on the edge of giving up, this story is for you. Let us know in the comments how it made you feel. Every voice adds to the legacy. And if you believe resilience is worth remembering, subscribe and be part of this journey with us. The past is not gone. It is flying just overhead. By 1944, the sound of the Thunderbolt had become something more than just engine noise. It was a message, not just to the Luftwaffe, but to the entire Axis war machine. The roar of the R-2800 radial engine wasn't just horsepower, it was the voice of American industry echoing across the skies of Europe. The tide was turning, but not because of any single battle. It was turning because the United States had shifted its entire economy toward war in a way the world had never seen. While Germany struggled to keep its production lines alive under Allied bombing, the United States was building planes in numbers that bordered on surreal. 15,660 P-47 Thunderbolts were produced between 1941 and 1945. That's more than any other American fighter of the war. At its peak, factories were rolling out over 500 per month. Republic Aviation's plant in Farmingdale, New York, worked around the clock. So did the plants in Evansville, Indiana, and various subcontracted assembly lines across the country. This was not just mass production. It was industrial warfare. The Thunderbolt was not designed to be elegant or efficient. It was designed to be built fast, fixed fast, and flown hard. Its radial engine required less precision cooling than liquid-cooled engines like those in the P-51 or the German Bf-109. That meant fewer vulnerabilities, fewer failures, more flying time. On the front lines, pilots quickly understood what that meant. If your P-47 came back shot to pieces, the maintenance crews would have it patched, refueled, and ready in 24 hours, sometimes less. Mechanics joked that the Thunderbolt was more like a flying truck than a fighter, rugged, ugly. But it did the job. In England, children watched from the hedgerows as formations of thunderbolts filled the skies like swarms of metal bees. You could hear them before you saw them. Their deep engine note was unmistakable. Veterans would later say that the sound of 850 caliber machine guns firing in unison was like the hammer of God slamming down on steel. And the Germans heard it too. There was a moment in early 1944 when Luftwaffe ground crews stationed near Rouen intercepted a group of P-47s sweeping in low. The base commander radioed for fighter cover. The reply came back bleak. No fuel, no pilots, no planes. The Thunderbolts arrived within minutes. They didn't just attack the runway. They tore through fuel depots, trucks, and maintenance sheds. The Germans later described the attack as being hit by a flying wall. There was no elegance, no finesse, just overwhelming force. That was the new American strategy. Attrition through repetition. Victory through volume. Every pilot trained. Every bomb dropped. Bullet fired. All backed by assembly lines that never stopped. The Germans, by contrast, were entering a phase of slow collapse. Synthetic fuel production was being bombed into dust. Aluminum was in short supply. Experienced pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Some squadrons were being staffed by teenagers with barely 20 hours in the cockpit. Meanwhile, American pilots were rotating home to train the next wave. Those who survived early missions like Robert S. Johnson became instructors, transferring hard-earned wisdom to the next group, who were already flying updated Thunderbolts with better range and smarter tactics. It was not just the aircraft that evolved, it was the system. There is a document preserved in the archives of the 8th Air Force that reads more like a factory memo than a combat report. It outlines aircraft delivery schedules for March 1944. Over 1,200 new aircraft arriving that month alone. Of those, 610 were Thunderbolts. A footnote at the EID bottom simply reads, "Keep the line moving. Every fighter counts." It is easy to overlook what that means. Behind every Thunderbolt was a machinist in Kansas, a riveter in Indiana, a designer in Long Island, a test pilot in California, a logistics officer tracking fuel drums across the Atlantic, a mechanic in England cannibalizing parts from one wrecked plane to keep 3 others flying. War, at that point, was no longer about duels in the sky. It was about who could keep flying. And America, for all its early missteps, had learned to fly on an industrial scale. There is a story told by the crew chief of the 303rd Fighter Group. He watched a Thunderbolt land after a brutal dogfight over Belgium. The plane was leaking oil, the left wingtip was missing, and one of the guns had jammed halfway through a burst. The pilot climbed out, covered in sweat and grit, looked at the crew chief, and said only one word, "Again." That was the power of the Thunderbolt. Not in its beauty, not in its agility, but in its promise. To be ready again, to fight again, to never stop showing up. For the men flying into flak and fire, that promise mattered more than any flight manual. And as